Well, happy Easter, whatever day or time you're watching this. Easter morning is one of the great joys and the turning point of world history. Simple as that. Everything changes on Easter morning. This is the year we're majoring on Luke's Gospel. So we're looking at the Gospel account in Luke. And the Gospel reading is Luke 24, 1 to 12. Luke's account of not quite the resurrection, but the first witnesses of the empty tomb. But to get that in its context and get the story, we need to start a little bit earlier on Good Friday afternoon, in the end of chapter 23 of Luke. You perhaps remember Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council who hadn't sided with the majority in wanting to get rid of Jesus. He asks Pontius Pilate for Jesus's body, and he takes it down and has it wrapped respectfully in a linen cloth and laid in a tomb, a cave tomb, which had never been used. And we're told in Luke 23, verse 54, it was the day of preparation. That's Friday, the day before the Sabbath. And the Sabbath was beginning. The Sabbath began at dusk on Friday. So it was beginning, it's coming towards dusk. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed. A number of women we read elsewhere in Luke, and we get mentions of them in other Gospels, but Luke does more of detail of the women. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandment. Now that's the background to Easter Day. Jesus has been laid in the tomb, wrapped in a new linen cloth, a new tomb, etc. And the women have followed and have seen how and where he's been laid. Now, these women, who we're told out of their own resources, supported the work of the disciples. They traveled with them and they looked after them. And it obviously included some women who were quite well off, and we know some of their names and bits of some of their stories. But it wasn't just the 12 disciples who traveled around with Jesus. They were all largely from the Galilee area. But it's the women as well, who are an important part of the wider band and the group. And of course, we hear some of the women were still there at the cross when the men had deserted. And so we get to the Gospel reading. On the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices they'd prepared. They found the stone rolled away, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, and the they right through is the women. This point, Luke doesn't name them. He's going to name some of them in a couple of minutes' time. But this is the women who've supported Jesus and traveled with him. And they are the first to find the empty tomb. Got the same in Matthew and in John, with slightly different, and in Mark with slightly different emphases. And then the women, in a few minutes' time, will be sent back, or will go back and bear witness to the disciples, to the 11 and all the rest, a crowd of followers of Jesus. The women are the first witnesses. This is one of the many little bits of irony in the Gospels, and a delightful one. In the Jewish world of that day, a woman's evidence wasn't usually accepted in court. There were various groups of people who couldn't be witnesses and give evidence because they were deemed in that society not to be quite reliable enough. That included women, it included certain categories of sinners, it included shepherds, because they were unclean working with animals. So the people who Luke quite bigs up in the story, Luke's the one who tells us about the shepherds and the angels at the beginning of the story as the first witnesses. And here Luke has women as witnesses as well. All this stuff about certain people not being worthy, certain people not being trustworthy, certain people being inferior to others, shepherds, women, etc. That goes out, it's gone. One of the things about Easter Day is that the women are the first witnesses. That's a significant moment, and one we need to look at and think on and take on board. So the women are perplexed. They've found the stone rolled away. They've gone in to the tomb, not found the body. And then two men in dazzling clothes stand beside them. They are terrified. The women, they bow their faces to the ground. And the men say, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." And they remembered his words, and returning, they told all this to the 11 and to the rest. The gospel writers, and even Luke, who is the non-Jewish gospel writer, who's writing for a non-Jewish readership, wants his readership to understand that Jesus' resurrection wasn't just God's emergency repair job after his crucifixion. Jesus' resurrection was part of the plan all along, part of God's plan through his ancient people, the Jews, to bring salvation to all the world. Jesus' death and resurrection weren't a dreadful accident and a wonderful repair job or restitution, restoration, whatever. They were part of the plan. And Luke, although non-Jewish, wants us to understand this, that it's part of God's plan. That's partly why Luke, although non-Jewish, gives Jesus' genealogy near the beginning of his gospel, not at the very beginning like Matthew. Matthew is the Jewish one, but Luke includes it. This is part of God's plan. Jesus is part of God's plan. Jesus' death and resurrection are part of God's plan. Jesus' resurrection is the absolute center of God's plan. Ultimately, because it tells us we don't just sleep, we don't just end when we die. There's no teaching in the Bible about immortal souls. That comes from other strange Eastern religions, Far Eastern religions. There's no immortal soul idea in the Bible, but there's resurrection in the Bible. And that's what is happening here. The world is changed and turned on its head. It's quite right that we have years before Christ, calendar before Christ, and calendar the year of our Lord. They got the date slightly wrong when they tried to work out the Christian calendar, which is why we now believe that Jesus was probably born in 4 BC as we count the dates. But if I had my way, the new calendar would have started on Resurrection Day rather than the day of his coming into the world, because it's Resurrection Day that changes everything. The women go to tell the disciples, and then Luke tells us who they are: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them. So it was a group of women, including the 2 Marys and Joanna. If you read the resurrection story in Matthew and Mark and John, you get snippets of that, you get different angles on it. Luke gives us yet another different angle. Witnesses do that. It depends who they've talked to Luke obviously wasn't there, and Luke had obviously talked to a number of the women who'd followed Jesus, because we get hints of their stories at various parts in his gospel that only they would have known. And the disciples, the apostles, don't believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, and we get that in John as well, where it's Peter and John. Here, we're just told it's Peter. Maybe that was as much as Luke knew. Peter ran to the tomb, looked in, saw the linen cloths by themselves, went home amazed. He's not believing yet. He hasn't got it yet. But he sees the linen cloths by themselves. That's another of the big evidences for the resurrection. People talk about grave robbers and all sorts of other options. If you're going to rob a grave, do you take the grave clothes off the body? I think not. People don't do that. Even when they rob graves, they don't strip the body first. But the linen clothes are there by themselves, because he isn't dead, he's alive. And Peter went back amazed, just amazed. And then Jesus is going to appear to them a bit later on, but not yet. He hasn't yet been seen by his followers. But notice strong evidence for the resurrection, clearly, in that it links in with what God has predicted and promised. Notice strong evidence that big stone rolled away. Notice the linen cloths folded by themselves. That's strong evidence too. You don't take the body and leave the grave clothes. And then notice the great irony and delightful irony that God entrusts the message of the resurrection first to angels. It's angels or men in shining clothes, but it's women who take the message to the disciples, to the apostles. The women are among the disciples. The women take the message to the apostles. The apostles don't believe them, because you don't have to believe what women say in that culture. They make up stories, or they delude themselves, or something as understood in that culture. The men have to find out for themselves. And Peter goes and finds out and still doesn't get it, because God doesn't send the angel to Peter. He sends the angel to the women who are unreliable witnesses in the culture of the day, but who are utterly reliable to God. They're the ones to whom he entrusts the message, and to whom he first tells this wonderful story that Jesus is not dead, he is risen. We rejoice today that Jesus is risen. We rejoice too in the way the story was told. Once again, as elsewhere in Luke's gospel, the underdog, the least respected, are the ones who are privileged with the divine revelation and hearing the story first, as at Jesus' birth, so at his resurrection. The women, shepherds at his birth, women at his empty tomb, are told to, they have to go and tell the apostles, and the apostles still don't get it until Jesus appears to them. We hear in John's gospel that Jesus himself appeared to Mary Magdalene. That bit isn't here. And Luke seems to be taking evidence from some of the others, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, whatever, the other women who were present. These stories are like every set of witness versions of an event. Each one sees it from a different angle. You need all of them together to get the whole picture. But whatever the picture, it's Jesus is alive, as promised in the scriptures, as promised by himself during his earthly ministry. And his resurrection, like his birth, are announced by angels, and his conception are announced by angels. These are matters that human beings would not have worked out, we need to be told. The presence of the angels is important because this is God's revelation. We're not saying the women are cleverer, they went and discovered, they worked it out. They had to be told, but God entrusted them as the first witnesses. Rejoice that God tells us his truth. Rejoice that God entrusts his truth to witnesses of all sorts. Rejoice that God brings an equality to all sorts. Rejoice that Jesus is alive. Amen.